Before we begin, I want to say a huge thank you for being here. If you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. As you probably know, YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of romantic storytelling content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and in the pinned comment below. And for those of you who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and way more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is exactly where you can find it. Alright, get comfortable. Take a deep breath. Let's get into the story. Have you ever met someone who felt like a locked door? Someone so intimidating, so perfectly put together, that you just know they are hiding something deeply fragile underneath. That was Julian Vance. At 34 years old, Julian was the youngest senior managing partner in the history of Vance, Sterling & Croft, the most cutthroat corporate law firm in Chicago. He was famously known in the legal world as the Iceberg, and the nickname wasn't just because of his striking, pale gray eyes or the immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suits he wore like armor. It was because 90% of his danger was hidden beneath the surface. He was brilliant, he was ruthless in a courtroom, and he was entirely, utterly unreachable. He didn't make friends, he didn't make small talk. He demanded perfection, and if you couldn't give it to him, you were gone. And then, there was Elias. Elias Thorne was 26 years old, a newly minted lawyer who had just passed the bar exam by the skin of his teeth, fueled entirely by spite, cheap espresso, and a burning desire to change the world. He was brilliant, yes, but he was chaotic. His ties were always slightly crooked. His dark hair always looked like he had just run his hands through it in frustration. He wore his heart so visibly on his sleeve that it practically bled onto his legal briefs. When Elias was hired as a junior associate at the firm, no one expected him to last a month. He was too loud, too passionate, too human for a place like Vance, Sterling & Croft. And naturally, by some cruel twist of fate, Elias was assigned directly to Julian Vance. I want you to picture their first meeting. It was a rainy Monday morning. Elias, carrying 3 massive boxes of case files, stumbled into Julian's massive, glass-walled corner office, overlooking the Chicago skyline. Julian was standing by the window, his back to the door, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. The silence in the room was so thick you could choke on it. "Put them on the floor," Julian's voice cut through the air, low, smooth, and freezing cold. He didn't even turn around. Elias, out of breath, dropped the boxes with a loud thud. "Good morning, Mr. Vance. I'm Elias Thorne. I'm your new—" "I know who you are, Mr. Thorne," Julian interrupted, finally turning. Elias froze. This was the first time he had ever seen Julian up close, and for a second, Elias actually forgot how to breathe. The rumors hadn't done the man justice. Julian was devastatingly handsome, but his gaze was so sharp it felt like it could cut glass. Julian's eyes dropped to Elias's slightly wrinkled collar, then back up to his eyes. "I don't care about your passion," Julian said quietly, walking slowly toward his massive mahogany desk. "I don't care about your ideals. I care about winning. We are currently representing the prosecution against Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. It is a multi-billion-dollar fraud case. The files in those boxes represent millions of ruined lives. If you make a single mistake, if you miss a single comma in a deposition, I will fire you before you can even blink. Do we understand each other?" Elias swallowed hard. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he didn't look away. Instead of backing down, Elias stood a little taller. "I don't make mistakes when it counts, Mr. Vance, and I don't quit." Julian stared at him. For a long, agonizing moment, the two men just locked eyes. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in Julian's expression, a flicker of curiosity, but it was gone in an instant. "We'll see," Julian murmured. "Start indexing box 1. That was the beginning of the most grueling, exhausting, and emotionally confusing 6 months of Elias's life. Working for Julian was like walking on a tightrope over a canyon. The hours were brutal. They worked late into the night, long after the rest of the firm had gone home. The massive office building would go completely silent, leaving only the two of them in Julian's dimly lit office, surrounded by mountains of legal documents. But as the weeks bled into months, something began to shift. The harsh lines of their professional boundaries started to blur, just a little. It started with small things, subconscious things. Elias noticed that Julian always rubbed his left temple when he was getting a migraine from staring at a screen too long. So, without saying a word, Elias started leaving a glass of water and 2 aspirin on the corner of Julian's desk at exactly 8 p.m. every night. Julian never thanked him out loud, but the pills were always gone. In return, Julian started doing things that absolutely baffled the rest of the firm. If a senior partner tried to yell at Elias for a minor formatting error, Julian would step in, his voice like liquid nitrogen, and tear the senior partner apart until they apologized. Julian was viciously protective of his junior associate. He would say it was just because Elias was his responsibility. But the way Julian looked at Elias, it told a different story. There was a magnetic pull between them. It was the kind of tension that makes the air feel heavy, the kind that makes the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up when the other person enters the room. One evening in late November, the tension finally boiled over into something tangible. It was almost midnight. Elias was in the firm's massive law library, trying to find a specific precedent from a 1998 corporate law journal. The library was completely dark except for a few reading lamps. The aisles of bookshelves were narrow and smelled of old paper and leather. Elias was standing on the second step of a rolling wooden ladder, reaching high up for a heavy red-bound book. He stretched, his fingers just brushing the spine, but he couldn't quite grip it. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him, the scent of bergamot, expensive cedar, and something uniquely warm filled his senses. A large, elegant hand reached over his shoulder, easily pulling the heavy book from the shelf. Elias gasped softly and turned his head. He was suddenly face to chest with Julian. Julian had taken off his suit jacket, his white dress shirt rolled up to the forearms, his tie loosened. He was standing so close that Elias could feel the heat radiating off of him. Elias was trapped between the ladder and Julian's body. If he took a breath, his chest would brush against Julian's. "You're going to fall, Elias," Julian murmured, his voice a low, raspy whisper that sent a shiver straight down Elias's spine. It was the first time Julian had ever used his first name. "I had it," Elias breathed, his voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting Julian's pale gray ones. Julian didn't step back. In fact, his gaze dropped to Elias's lips for a fraction of a second before slowly rising back to his eyes. The silence between them was deafening. All Elias could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart. Julian's hand was resting lightly on the ladder, right next to Elias's hip. His fingers twitched, as if he was fighting the urge to reach out and touch him. "You're working too late," Julian said softly. The coldness in his voice was completely gone, replaced by a heavy, dangerous warmth. "So are you," Elias whispered back, unable to look away. He felt entirely exposed under Julian's intense stare. There was so much longing in the older man's eyes, a desperate kind of hunger that he was keeping locked behind a wall of sheer willpower. For a second, Elias thought Julian was going to lean in. He saw Julian take a shallow breath, his jaw tightening. But then, the illusion shattered. Julian cleared his throat, stepping back abruptly and handing the book to Elias. "Find the precedent," Julian said, his voice back to its usual crisp, professional tone. "I want the brief on my desk by 8 a.m." And he turned and walked out of the library, leaving Elias standing on the ladder, his heart pounding out of his chest, feeling completely breathless. Things between them were never the same after that night. The unspoken words hung in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Every time their hands accidentally brushed when passing a file, it felt like an electric shock. Every time Elias caught Julian staring at him during a deposition, his stomach did a slow, nervous flip. Elias was falling in love with his boss. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It could ruin both of their careers, but he couldn't stop it. He saw the way Julian fought for their clients. He saw the secret, exhausted smiles Julian gave him when they found a loophole in the Vanguard Pharma case. Beneath the iceberg, Julian was a fiercely loyal, deeply lonely man. And Elias wanted nothing more than to be the one to break through the ice. And just a small reminder, if you are completely captivated by this story and want more continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL on Patreon. The link is right there in the description and pinned comment. Your support makes all of this possible. Now, back to the tension. The climax of the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals case arrived in December. The city was covered in a thick blanket of snow, and the pressure in the firm was suffocating. They were going up against a team of cutthroat defense attorneys who would stop at nothing to win. The lead defense attorney was a man named Marcus Sterling. Marcus was slick, arrogant, and notoriously dirty. And during a pre-trial negotiation meeting, Marcus took a sudden, very clear interest in Elias. Throughout the meeting, Marcus kept directing his comments to Elias, completely ignoring Julian. He leaned across the conference table, flashing Elias a predatory smile. "You know, Elias," Marcus purred, eyeing the younger lawyer up and down, "you're wasting your talent sitting behind Vance. He works his associates to the bone. If you ever want a real job, with a partner who actually knows how to treat young talent, my door is always open. We could have dinner tonight to discuss it." Elias felt his skin crawl. Before he could politely decline, the entire temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees. Julian, who had been sitting quietly with his hands steepled, suddenly pushed his chair back. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Julian stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Marcus with a gaze so terrifyingly cold, so full of pure, unadulterated murder, that the opposing attorney actually shrank back in his chair. "If you ever speak to my associate like that again," Julian said softly, every word dripping with venom, "I will not just bury your client in this trial. I will dedicate the rest of my miserable, overfunded life to dismantling your career, piece by piece. Do you understand me, Marcus?" The room was dead silent. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding once. "Good," Julian snapped. Meeting adjourned. Julian stormed out of the conference room. Elias scrambled to pack up his notes and ran down the hallway after him. He caught up to Julian just as he entered his private office, slamming the door shut behind them. "Julian, wait," Elias said, dropping the files on a chair. Julian was pacing behind his desk, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time since Elias had met him. He looked furious, but underneath the anger, he looked panicked. "He had no right," Julian practically growled, glaring at the floor. "He had no right to look at you like that, to speak to you like that." "Julian, it's fine." Elias stepped closer, his voice soft. "He's just an arrogant jerk trying to get under your skin. I wasn't going to accept." "That's not the point," Julian snapped, finally looking up. His gray eyes were wild, filled with an emotion he could no longer hide. "The point is that you are mine." The words slipped out before Julian could stop them. He froze, his eyes widening slightly, as the echo of what he had just said bounced off the glass walls. "You are mine." Elias stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. "Julian," Elias whispered, taking a slow step toward him. Julian held up a hand, stepping back until his back hit the glass window. He looked terrified. The great, untouchable Julian Vance looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Don't," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. "Don't step any closer, Elias. Please." "Why?" Elias asked, his voice trembling but determined. He didn't listen. He took another step forward. "Why do you keep pushing me away? I see the way you look at me. I feel it. You know I feel it. Because I will ruin you." Julian suddenly burst out, opening his eyes. His chest heaved as years of carefully built walls finally shattered. "Look at me, Elias. I am hollow. I live in this office. I have nothing else. I destroy people for a living. You are bright. You are passionate. You actually believe in justice. If I let you in, if I let myself have this, I'll drag you down into the dark with me, and I would rather die than dim your light." Elias stared at him. The sheer vulnerability, the agonizing confession of love disguised as a warning, it broke Elias's heart completely open. Without hesitating, Elias walked across the room, closing the distance between them. Julian tensed, trying to pull away, but Elias reached out, pressing his palms flat against Julian's chest. He could feel Julian's heart pounding furiously against his ribcage. "You don't get to decide what ruins me," Elias said fiercely, looking directly into Julian's fearful eyes. "You think you're dark? You think you're cold? Julian, you're the most protective, deeply caring man I have ever met. You just hide it because you're terrified of getting hurt." Julian let out a shaky breath, looking down at Elias's hands on his chest. Slowly, tentatively, Julian raised his own hands, his trembling fingers gently wrapping around Elias's wrists. "Elias," Julian breathed, his voice breaking. "If I kiss you right now, I will never be able to let you go. I will be entirely selfish with you. I won't be able to stop." Elias's eyes filled with tears, a soft, incredibly beautiful smile breaking across his face. He slid his hands up Julian's chest, wrapping his arms around Julian's neck. "Then don't let me go," Elias whispered. Julian let out a desperate, fractured sound, a sound of complete surrender. He pulled Elias against him, his large hands gripping Elias's waist, pulling him flush against his body, and finally, he brought his mouth down onto Elias's. The kiss was an explosion. It wasn't gentle at first. It was years of starvation, months of agonizing longing pouring out in a single moment. Julian kissed him like a drowning man finding oxygen. Elias gasped into the kiss, tangling his fingers into Julian's dark hair, kissing him back with just as much fire and desperation. Julian's hands moved up, one hand cradling the back of Elias's neck, the other resting warmly on his cheek, his thumb tracing Elias's jawbone. As the initial desperation faded, the kiss slowed, turning into something profoundly deep, soft, and heartbreakingly tender. Julian poured every unspoken word, every late night, every protective glance into the way his lips moved against Elias's. Elias felt a tear escape his eye, rolling down his cheek, only for Julian to gently kiss it away. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Their foreheads rested against each other. Julian's eyes were closed, his face completely relaxed for the first time since Elias had known him. The harsh, untouchable Iceberg had melted entirely. "You have no idea," Julian whispered, his thumb stroking Elias's cheek. "How long I have wanted to do that. How many nights I sat at this desk, watching you read, just imagining what you would taste like." Elias let out a wet laugh, a blush spreading across his cheeks. "You're a terrible boss." "The worst," Julian agreed softly, finally opening his eyes. The look he gave Elias was so full of adoration, it made Elias's knees feel weak. "But I think I'm going to be a very, very good partner." The Vanguard Pharmaceuticals case ended 2 weeks later. Against all odds, they won. They completely dismantled the corrupt company, securing millions of dollars in settlements for the victims. When the judge hit the gavel, the courtroom erupted. Elias, sitting next to Julian at the prosecution table, let out a massive sigh of relief, slumping back in his chair. Under the table, hidden from the eyes of the packed courtroom, Julian's hands slipped over, his long fingers securely and possessively intertwining with Elias's. Elias looked over. Julian wasn't smiling with his mouth, but his gray eyes were glowing with pride, warmth, and a quiet, profound love. That night, they didn't go back to the office to work. They went to Julian's penthouse apartment, and as the snow fell over the Chicago skyline, the great, untouchable Julian Vance held the man he loved in his arms, finally realizing that he didn't have to be cold to be strong. He had found his warmth, he had found his home, and that is where we will leave Julian and Elias for tonight. If you loved this story, if you felt the tension, the longing, and the absolute relief of that ending, please let me know in the comments. I love reading your reactions. And as I mentioned before, if you want to support this channel and read the continuation of this story, what happens when they finally go back to Julian's penthouse, the morning after, the bonus scenes, and all the uncensored 18+ BL content that YouTube won't let me share here, please come join us over on SpicyTimeBL. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Your support on Patreon is the only way I can keep writing and narrating these stories for you, and I promise, the content over there is exactly what you're looking for. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, stay romantic, and I'll see you in the next story.